The moment Helen Whitaker stepped through the wide oak doors of the Caldwell Cattle Fair, every head in the room turned, though none stayed fixed on her the way his did. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat right on the edge of everything a person could want and everything a person could lose. The cattle trade was booming, the Kishom Trail still carrying longhorns northward in great dusty rivers, and the air in September smelled of leather and hay, and the particular kind of promise that only the frontier can manufacture. Caldwell had grown fast in the past 2 years, sprouting saloons and dry goods stores and a proper hotel almost overnight, and the annual cattle fair was its crowning achievement, the one event that drew ranchers and buyers and curious townspeople from miles in every direction. Helen had not wanted to come. She had stood in front of her small bedroom mirror that morning for a long time, looking at a woman she barely recognized. She was 31 years old. With dark chestnut hair she wore pinned carefully at the nape of her neck, and gray-green eyes that people in her former life used to say were the color of a Kansas sky before a storm. She was not a vain woman, but she was an honest one, and the honesty told her that the past 2 years had carved something into her face that had not been there before. A thinning of the mouth, a particular stillness around the eyes, the quiet that grief leaves behind when it finally gets tired of being loud. Her husband, Robert Whitaker, had died in the winter of 1876. A fever, swift and merciless, that took him in 11 days and left Helen with 160 acres of scrubland northeast of Caldwell, a small herd of cattle, a barn that needed a new roof, and a daughter named Clara who was 8 years old and had her father's stubborn jaw and Helen's gray-green eyes. For 2 years Helen had run the land herself, hiring 2 seasonal hands when she could afford them, and doing the rest with her own 2 hands when she could not. She had mended fences in driving rain. She had nursed sick calves back to health at 3 in the morning with lantern light and sheer will. She had learned to read the sky the way Robert used to, watching for the particular green tinge that meant hail, the purple bank on the western horizon that meant a real storm. She had done all of it without complaint and without much in the way of help, because the women of Caldwell pitied her in a way that made her feel smaller than the grief itself, and the men of Caldwell looked at her land and her situation with a kind of calculating interest that had nothing to do with kindness. It was Clara who had finally insisted she come to the fair. "Mama," Clara had said that morning, standing in the kitchen doorway in her good dress, the blue one with the white collar, "you have not been anywhere except the feed store and church in 3 months. That is not living. Papa would not have liked it." Helen had looked at her daughter for a long moment. 8 years old and already wielding the memory of Robert like a precise instrument, she had almost smiled. "Your papa," Helen had said carefully, "would have told you not to be impertinent." "He would have told you to go to the fair," Clara had replied, utterly untroubled. And so here she was. She walked into the Caldwell Fairgrounds building, which was the largest structure in town, a great converted warehouse that smelled of sawdust and animal and the particular excitement of commerce. Long tables ran down the center, draped in cloth, holding samples of grain and rope and equipment. At the far end, cattle records and breeding logs were spread out for the buyers. Along the walls, local ranchers had set up small stations, and the noise was tremendous, the rise and fall of men doing business, the occasional burst of laughter, the distant lowing of cattle from the pens outside. Helen wore her best dress, the dark blue wool one that she had bought in her first year of marriage and had let out twice and taken in once since then. She carried a leather satchel with the papers for her cattle, because she had 3 yearlings she was hoping to sell at fair price, and that was the practical reason she had finally agreed to come. She needed the money for the barn roof before the first hard freeze came. Clara walked beside her, wide-eyed and delighted, already pointing at the candy seller who had set up near the entrance. "Stay close," Helen said quietly and took her daughter's hand. She was aware immediately of the way people noticed her, Not unkindly, most of them. Caldwell was not a cruel town exactly. But a widow alone at the cattle fair was still a particular kind of curiosity, and she could feel the weight of it, the glances that slid away when she met them, the small adjustments in conversation as she passed. The wives of the established ranchers nodded at her with expressions that managed to communicate both sympathy and relief that they were not in her position. The men tipped their hats and said nothing useful. Helen lifted her chin and moved toward the cattle records table because she had business to do and she had not come all this way to feel sorry for herself. It was while she was speaking to old Gerald Marsh, one of the fair's organizers, about the process for registering her yearlings for sale consideration, that she became aware, in that particular way a person becomes aware of being watched, that someone in the room had not looked away. She did not turn immediately. She finished her conversation with Gerald, accepted the registration papers he handed her, and thanked him with the precise courtesy that Robert had always said was one of her finest qualities. Then, with the unhurried manner of someone who was simply surveying the room, she let her gaze travel along the far wall. He was standing in the corner, not leaning exactly, though his shoulder rested against the wooden wall with an ease that suggested he was entirely comfortable in his own body. He was tall, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor work rather than any particular effort at it. He wore a dark brown coat over a gray shirt, trail-worn boots, and a hat that had seen considerable use. His hair was dark, going a little at the temples, and he had the face of a man who had spent a great deal of time squinting into the sun, all sharp angles and a jaw that had enough character in it to be interesting without being severe. He was looking directly at her. Not with the calculating interest she had grown accustomed to from the men of Caldwell who saw a widow with land and did their arithmetic. Not with pity, either. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that has genuinely surprised them, with a focused, unguarded attention that he did not appear to be making any effort to disguise. When her eyes met his, he did not look away. Helen held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to communicate that she had noticed and was not alarmed, and then she looked back down at her registration papers. Her heart, to her considerable irritation, was beating slightly faster. "Mama," Clara said, tugging her hand, "may I go look at the horses outside?" "With whom?" Helen asked, gathering herself. "Mrs. Albright said she would watch me. She is right there." Clara pointed to where Margaret Albright, the blacksmith's wife and one of the few women in Caldwell who managed to be kind without being condescending, stood near the door waving at them both. Helen nodded. "Stay with Mrs. Albright. Do not go past the paddock fence." Clara was already moving. Helen watched her go, and then she turned back to her papers and tried very hard not to look at the corner again. She failed approximately 4 minutes later. He was still there, still watching her. And now, seeing that she had looked again, the corner of his mouth moved upward in something that was not quite a smile, but contained the same fundamental material. Helen set her jaw and went to find the yearling pen. The yearlings were good animals, 2 roan and 1 black, strong-boned and well-tempered, and she spent some time with them because they were familiar and uncomplicated in a way that the interior of the fair building was not. She spoke to them quietly while she checked their condition, running her hands along their flanks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that it was second nature, and she was so absorbed in the work that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until they stopped. "Those are fine animals." The voice was low and unhurried, with a slight roughness to it that suggested it did not see a great deal of indoor use. Helen straightened and turned, and found herself looking at approximately the 3rd button of a gray shirt, which meant she had to tilt her head back a degree to find his face. He was even taller up close. The hat shaded his eyes somewhat, but she could see now that they were a very dark brown, nearly black, and that they were still doing that particular thing where they looked at her with complete attention. "They are," she said, because it was true and because it gave her a moment to recover her composure. "I noticed the registration you put in with Gerald," he said, and his tone was entirely straightforward, no particular performance in it. "I am in the market for yearlings. I wanted to ask if you had settled on a price." Helen regarded him for a moment. "You might have asked inside," she said, "rather than following me out." "I might have," he agreed, and something in his expression shifted, became a fraction more careful, more respectful. "I apologize if I was forward. I only thought it might be easier to speak plainly out here." Helen considered this. He was not wrong. The inside of the fair building had ears attached to mouths, and she was already providing enough material for conversation without adding a prolonged discussion about cattle prices with a man she did not recognize. "Who are you?" she asked directly. "Andrew Carson," he said, and removed his hat, which she appreciated. "I run the Double C Ranch, 20 miles southeast of here, over toward the Oklahoma border." The Double C, she had heard of it distantly. A well-run operation, she believed, moderate-sized, not one of the great sprawling concerns that dominated the territory, but solid, reputable. "Helen Whitaker," she said. "I own the Whitaker spread northeast of town." "I know who you are," Andrew said, and then, seeing something shift in her expression, he added quickly, "Not in the way you might think. I heard Gerald mention your name when I came in. That is all." She studied him for a moment. He had the particular quality of stillness that she had noticed in the most reliable men she had ever known, her father, Robert in his better moments, old Gerald himself. The kind of stillness that meant a person thought before they spoke and meant what they said when they did. "The price I have in mind," she said, "is $18 a head for the roans and 20 for the black." Andrew looked at the animals. He moved to the fence, rested his forearms on the top rail, and studied them with the unhurried concentration of a man who knew what he was looking at. He was quiet for long enough that another person might have felt compelled to fill the silence, but Helen had learned to be comfortable with silence in the past 2 years, and she waited. "That is a fair price for the black," he said at last. "The roans might go at 16 if you take them to the main auction." "The main auction takes a percentage," Helen said. "At 16 each through the auction I clear less than at my price." He turned his head and looked at her with something that might, on a different face, have been amusement. "You have thought it through," he said. "I have had to," she said simply. Something moved across his face at that, something that was not pity and not sympathy in the usual soft, useless form she had grown accustomed to receiving. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a person who understood, not because they felt sorry, but because they had been required to think things through themselves and knew what that cost. 18 for the roans and 20 for the black," he said. "Done." Helen blinked because she had expected to negotiate further, just like that. "They are worth it," Andrew said simply, "and you knew the right price." A person who knows the right price deserves to receive it. Helen was quiet for a moment because something about the straightforward honesty of that statement disarmed her in a way she had not anticipated. "The transfer of papers would need to be done through the fair office," she said, gathering herself. "Gerald can witness it." "Of course," Andrew said. He straightened from the fence and put his hat back on. "I appreciate you speaking with me, Mrs. Whitaker." He paused and then he said, "I apologize again for watching you the way I did inside. I am aware it was not subtle." Helen looked at him. The afternoon light was hitting the side of his face, and he looked entirely sincere, which was either genuine or a very accomplished performance, and her instinct, honed by 2 years of sorting out which of the men who approached her were worth listening to, said genuine. "Why were you watching me?" she asked. It was a direct question and she knew it, but she had stopped pretending she was not curious. Andrew was quiet for just a moment, and she had the sense of him choosing his words with care. "Because you walked in alone," he said, "and you did not look afraid, and I found that remarkable." Helen opened her mouth and then closed it again. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. He nodded to her, courteous and entirely composed, and turned to walk back inside to find Gerald Marsh. Helen stood with her yearlings and her registration papers, and the particular warmth of a compliment she had not expected, and she looked at the late September sky above Caldwell, and she thought that perhaps Clara had been right. The paperwork for the cattle sale took the better part of an hour, as these things always did, because Gerald believed in documentation and Andrew was thorough in a way that suggested he had been on the wrong side of a careless transaction at some point in his life, and had no interest in repeating the experience. Helen sat across the table from him in the fair office, a small room off the main floor, and she watched him read every clause of the transfer agreement with unhurried attention, and she found herself thinking that he was the kind of man who was worth watching, not in the way he had watched her with that focused, unguarded attention, but in the ordinary sense of learning a person by observing how they went about things. He signed his name in a clear, strong hand. Andrew P. Carson. What does the P stand for? She asked because the question was there before she could decide whether it was appropriate. He looked up. Patrick, he said, my mother's father's name. She was particular about keeping it. Were you close with her? Helen asked. Something shifted in his face, a brief, soft movement. She died when I was 15, he said, but yes, while she was alive. I am sorry, Helen said, and meant it. It was a long time ago, he said, which was true, but which she recognized as the thing people said when something was still with them and they had simply made their peace with carrying it. Gerald signed as witness, blotted the ink, and handed each of them their copy. The $56 would be settled by Andrew's factor at the bank in town the following morning, which was the standard arrangement. Helen folded her copy of the transfer and put it in her satchel. Can I offer you some supper? Andrew asked, and then immediately, I apologize, that was too forward, you do not know me. Helen looked at him. It would be premature, she said carefully. Yes. He nodded, and she could see that he understood her meaning precisely, which was not no forever, only not now. Then perhaps, he said, you would allow me to tip my hat and say that I hope the rest of your fair day is a good one. That would be appropriate, she said, and almost smiled. He tipped his hat, and he left, and Helen sat in the fair office for a moment longer than she needed to, with her transfer papers and her $56 coming, and a sensation in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, something that was not grief and was not loneliness, but was something adjacent to both of them, something that had the quality of a door that had been closed for a long time standing slightly ajar. She found Clara near the candy cellar, predictably, with Margaret Albright keeping easy watch. Clara had a peppermint stick and a quantity of energy that the peppermint had done nothing to diminish. Did you sell the yearlings, Mama? Clara asked immediately. I did, Helen said. At your price. Helen looked at her daughter, who was her father's child in this particular way, practical and interested in outcomes. At my price, she confirmed. Clara nodded with satisfaction. Papa always said you drove the hardest bargain in the county. Helen laughed, and it came out of her so easily that it surprised her. A real laugh, full and warm, and Margaret Albright looked at her with an expression of such transparent relief and pleasure that Helen nearly laughed again. The drive home that evening was quiet and golden, the kind of autumn evening that Kansas produced occasionally, as if in apology for everything else it subjected a person to. Clara fell asleep in the wagon seat before they were 2 miles from town, her head against Helen's shoulder, and Helen drove through the long golden light with one hand on the reins and her daughter warm against her side, and she thought about a tall man in a brown coat who had watched her walk in and had called her remarkable for not being afraid. She was afraid, of course. She had been afraid almost every day for 2 years. But she had learned, in the necessity of running the ranch and raising Clara and facing whatever the day brought, to carry the fear quietly and go about her work anyway. She had not known that was visible. She had not known that someone might look at it and see something worth watching. She put Andrew Carson away in a careful corner of her mind and told herself firmly that she did not expect to see him again, that the cattle transaction was complete and there was no particular reason their paths should cross, and that she was going to focus on the barn roof and the coming winter and Clara's arithmetic lessons, which had recently become battlegrounds. She almost believed herself. The $56 arrived at the Caldwell bank the following morning exactly as promised, and when Helen went in to collect it, Oliver Marsh, who was no relation to fair organizer Gerald, told her with the excited air of a man sharing significant news that Andrew Carson had ridden all the way from the Double C and back, just to settle the payment in person before riding back again. "Didn't even stay for coffee," Oliver said, with the tone of someone who found this either admirable or excessive, and had not yet decided which. Helen took her money and said nothing, but she thought about it on the drive home, and then she thought about it again while she was checking the barn roof and making her list of materials, and then she tried very hard not to think about it anymore, with moderate success. The following 3 weeks were busy in the way that autumn on a ranch was always busy, the endless preparation for winter that left a person tired in the bones by the time evening came. Helen hired one of her usual seasonal hands, a quiet man named Pete Dawson who was reliable if not imaginative, for the final weeks of work before the cold set in. She rode her fence lines and repaired 2 stretches that had gone soft. She got in the last of her hay. She paid the materials for the barn roof on credit at the feed store, calculating that the $56 from the yearlings plus what she expected to clear from her remaining cattle sales would cover it. And on a Thursday morning in early October, 3 weeks and 2 days after the cattle fair, she was in Caldwell buying flour and salt and dried beans at Hennessy's general store when she turned from the counter and walked directly into Andrew Carson. Not literally, because she had better reflexes than that, but nearly. She stopped about a foot away from him and he stopped immediately, and they looked at each other in the middle of Hennessy's general store with the flour and the memory of the cattle fair and the $56 and the corner of the room all between them. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Carson," she said. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds that was deeply comfortable on both sides, and then they both started to speak at the same moment and both stopped. Helen pressed her lips together, amused in spite of herself. "You first," she said. "I was going to ask how the yearlings had settled in," he said. "The black one in particular, she seemed a little high-strung." "I would not know," Helen said. "I sold them to you." "Of course," he said, and something in his face shifted in a way that made her think he was more nervous than he was letting on, which she found unreasonably endearing. "The black is settling well as it happens. She had a day or 2 of adjustment and then decided the Double C was acceptable." "Sensible animal," Helen said. He smiled then. A real smile, not the almost smile she had seen at the fair, and it did something considerable to his face, opened it up in a way that made him look younger and warmer and entirely disarming. "I was going to say," he said carefully, "that if the offer of supper is still premature, perhaps coffee is less so." Helen looked at him. The store was not empty, and she was aware of at least 2 pairs of ears that were doing their best to appear uninterested. She thought of Clara at school. She thought of the barn roof. She thought of the way he had said she had not looked afraid. "There is a decent dining room at the hotel," she said. "Coffee there would be public and entirely unobjectionable." "Entirely," he agreed, with a gravity that she thought might be containing amusement. They had coffee at the hotel dining room, and it lasted 2 hours. She learned that he was 34 years old, that he had come to Kansas from Missouri at the age of 22, with $100 and a horse and a considerable amount of stubbornness, and that the Double C, which he had built from nothing over 12 years, ran approximately 400 head of cattle on land that had cost him more difficulty than money. Because the land in that corner of Kansas had been disputed territory, and the acquisition of it had involved several years of legal proceedings and one genuinely dangerous confrontation with a neighboring outfit that had believed might made right and had been disabused of this notion by Andrew's persistent, documented, entirely legal approach to the matter. He had never been married. He said this without apology or particular emphasis, the way a person states a fact they have made their peace with. He had, he said, been too occupied with building the ranch in his 20s and had perhaps become too set in his own rhythms in his 30s, and he acknowledged this with the honesty of a man who had examined the matter clearly. Helen, in turn, found herself speaking about Robert with less difficulty than she usually experienced. She said that he had been a good man, which was true, and that the ranch had been his dream more than hers, which was also true, and that she had come to love it in her own way through the necessity of learning it. She said that Clara was the best thing she had any hand in making, which she said with such unguarded conviction that Andrew looked at her with that focused, attentive expression again. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She is 8 and already an excellent negotiator," Helen said. "I am trying to decide if I should be concerned or impressed. Both, probably," Andrew said, "in equal measure." Helen laughed and he smiled, and the waitress refilled their coffee without being asked because she was clearly invested in how this was going. "May I ask you something directly?" Andrew said when the waitress had retreated. "I would prefer it," Helen said. She had always preferred direct questions to the circling approach which telegraphed its own uncertainty. "Are you open to company?" he asked. "Not in any particular direction, just company. I find that I would like to know you better, and I want to be honest about that before I invest either of us in something you would not welcome." Helen sat with this for a moment. She liked that he had asked the question that most men in his position would have simply assumed the answer to, or would have worked around with the particular indirection of people who did not want to be told no. "I find," she said carefully, "that I am more open to it than I expected to be." Andrew nodded, and she could see the relief in him, quiet and genuine, and that too was disarming, the fact that it mattered to him enough to be relieved. They arranged that he would call at the ranch the following Sunday afternoon, which was the day Clara was not at school, and which would therefore allow the meeting that Helen knew would happen to happen on ground she controlled, which was important. Andrew arrived on Sunday afternoon in good weather, which the Kansas autumn provided about half the time and which Helen had somewhat superstitiously hoped for. He rode in on a good bay horse, carrying his hat in his hand when he came to the door, which was the gesture of a man who had been raised with some consideration for how to approach a woman's home. Clara answered the door before Helen could get to it, because Clara had been watching from the window for 20 minutes and had strong opinions about first access. Helen came into the parlor to find her daughter regarding Andrew with the solemn, appraising look that she usually reserved for horses she was uncertain about. "You are the man who bought our yearlings," Clara said. "I am," Andrew confirmed with perfect seriousness, taking Clara's directness as seriously as he took her mother's. "Did they settle in well? The black one took a few days," he said, "but she is comfortable now." Clara appeared to consider this. "Mama said you paid the right price without arguing about it." "Clara," Helen said from the doorway with a tone that communicated several things simultaneously. "I did," Andrew said. "They were worth it." Clara looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at Helen, and then she went back to her stool by the fire and picked up her book, which in Clara's particular language meant he had passed the first evaluation. Helen made coffee and Andrew sat at the kitchen table, and they talked for 3 hours while Clara read and occasionally contributed a remark that was more relevant than a child's interjection had any right to be. Andrew had a patience with Clara that was not the careful, performed patience of adults who found children difficult, but the genuine ease of someone who simply was not troubled by the way children occupied space and asked questions and said exactly what they thought. At one point Clara asked him if he had ever been in a gunfight, and Andrew said that he had been in a situation once that came close, but that he had found it preferable to resolve matters with a lawyer, which Clara examined with evident skepticism. "Did the lawyer work?" she asked. "Better than a gun would have," Andrew said. Clara seemed to find this philosophically interesting and went back to her book. When Andrew left that evening, he shook Helen's hand at the door, which was the right gesture, formal enough to be respectful of the distance still between them and warm enough to communicate that he did not intend that distance to be permanent. "May I come again?" he asked. "Sunday after next," Helen said. "Clara has a school recitation this coming Sunday." "Would it be acceptable," he said carefully, "to attend the recitation?" Helen blinked. "You would want to?" "If it would not be unwelcome," he said. "I understand if it is too much too soon. I only thought to ask." Helen thought about how it would look, and then she thought about how much she had come to care about how things looked and at what cost to herself, and then she said, "I think Clara would be pleased. She is performing a poem she composed herself, which is either very brave or very alarming, and I have not yet decided which." Andrew smiled. "Both," he said, "in equal measure." Helen stood in her doorway and watched him ride back down the lane in the early dark, and she thought that something was happening to her that she had not planned for and was not sure she had the defenses for, and that this was either the most frightening thing that had happened to her since Robert died or possibly something else entirely. The school recitation was held on a Saturday afternoon in the Caldwell schoolhouse, a modest building that smelled of chalk and the particular earnestness of children who had been told their work mattered. Helen sat in the third row. Andrew arrived 5 minutes before the recitation began and sat beside her without fanfare, removing his hat and holding it in his lap, and Margaret Albright, who was 2 rows ahead, turned around and gave Helen a look of such profound and satisfied approval that Helen had to concentrate very hard on the program paper in her hands. Clara's poem was about a hawk she had watched hunting over the eastern pasture one morning in September. It was observational and precise and entirely Clara, and it received genuine applause, and Andrew clapped with the rest of them and afterward told Clara, when she came racing down from the small stage, that it was the finest description of a hawk hunting that he had ever encountered in verse. Clara received this with the dignity of a person who expected nothing less, and then she took Andrew's hand and pulled him toward the refreshment table, apparently having decided that he was acceptable enough to be trusted with the selection of cookies. Helen watched this and felt something move through her chest, warm and a little frightening, something that had to do with her daughter, and with this man she had known for less than 2 months, and with the way they stood at the refreshment table together, Andrew bending down slightly to hear what Clara was saying with complete attention. She thought of Robert. She thought of him often still, the shape of him in the morning light, his laugh, his stubbornness, the fever that had taken him before he had a chance to see his daughter hawk-watching in the eastern pasture at dawn. She carried him with her, and she always would, and she knew now that she had made a kind of peace with that carrying the dead did not have to mean refusing the living. The days shortened, and the air sharpened, and Andrew Carson became a regular presence in the rhythm of Helen's life in the way that a thing that is right tends to establish itself, gradually and then undeniably. He rode out on Sundays and occasionally on a Thursday when his work permitted. He helped with the barn roof on a Saturday in late October when Helen's progress with Pete and 2 reluctant neighbors had stalled, arriving with 2 of his own hands and the efficient organization of a man who had built things and knew how it was done. The roof was finished by end of day, and when Helen tried to discuss payment, he looked at her with such mild patience that she stopped. "It is not charity," he said carefully, when she pressed the point, because she pressed every point. "If you are determined to account for it, call it the cost of being a neighbor. You are 20 miles away," she said. "Distance is relative out here," he said, "and you know that." She did know that. The West did not operate on the same measurements as the East, and 20 miles between neighbors was nothing in this country. What she could offer, and did offer, was the dinner she made that evening after the roof was finished. A proper meal with her best tablecloth and the venison stew that had been Robert's favorite recipe, and that she had made her own over the years. Andrew's 2 hands ate in the bunkhouse with Pete, and Andrew sat at Helen's kitchen table while Clara talked at considerable length about the difference between roan and dun coloring in horses, and Helen served the stew and biscuits, and a dried apple pie she had made that morning. It was the most ordinary evening she had spent in 2 years, and the most content she had felt in approximately the same period, and she recognized both of these things with a clarity that she did not push away. After Clara was in bed, Helen and Andrew sat on the front porch in the cold autumn dark with cups of coffee, and the stars over Kansas were extraordinary, the way they always were out here, thick and bright and indifferent to human concerns. "What will you do with the ranch?" he asked. It was not a calculating question, the kind she had fielded from men who were really asking about the land. It was the question of someone interested in her plans. "Keep it," she said immediately. "Improve it." Robert had a vision for what it could be, and he did not have time to finish it. "I intend to finish it." What was the vision? Better stock, she said. He wanted to shift from Longhorns to the Hereford cattle that were coming in. Better quality, better price per head. He had done some reading on it. She paused. "I have been continuing the reading." Andrew turned his head and looked at her in the dark. "I have been considering the same thing," he said. "The Herefords are coming in from England, and the market for quality beef is going to be better than for volume." Helen looked at him. "I know," she said. "I wrote to a breeder in Colorado 6 months ago." He laughed low and warm, and she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "you are the most prepared person I have met in 20 years in this territory." "Helen," she said, "you have been here enough times now that Mrs. Whitaker has become excessive." There was a brief silence in which she was aware of him adjusting to this, the way one adjusts to a door that has been opened further than expected. "Helen," he said simply, and she liked the sound of it in his voice. "Andrew," she said, which she had not said before, and he went very still for a moment in the way of a man absorbing something he had hoped for and was not yet sure was real. The November cold came in with its usual lack of apology, and the winter settled over the Whitaker ranch with the particular weight of Kansas winter, which was not always the most severe in the territory, but was consistent in its demand for vigilance. Helen managed it as she had managed the previous 2 winters, with preparation and attention and the occasional help of Pete Dawson, who stayed on through the cold months at a reduced rate because he had nowhere else particular to be, and found the Whitaker ranch a decent winter station. Andrew rode out when the weather allowed, and when it did not allow he sent letters. This was perhaps the thing that surprised Helen most, that he wrote well, clearly and without unnecessary flourish, in the manner of a man who had taught himself to write in circumstances where learning required effort. He wrote about the Double C and the winter work, and occasionally about things he had read, because he was a reader in the way that people who have had to be largely self-sufficient tend to be readers, broadly and with genuine interest. Helen wrote back, and found that she wrote to him in a way she had not written to anyone since Robert, with the easy honesty of someone who trusted the recipient. Clara, who intercepted and read the salutation of one of Andrew's letters before Helen could prevent it, gave Helen a look of such undisguised satisfaction that Helen had to leave the room. In February, a cattle sickness moved through the eastern part of the territory with the swift, indiscriminate cruelty of illness in winter, and Helen lost 4 head in 2 weeks, which was a serious loss and not one she had budgeted for. She did the arithmetic with the bleak efficiency of necessity and determined that she could manage it barely, if the spring calving went well and she was careful through March. She did not write to Andrew about it for 10 days, not because she was ashamed, but because she needed to understand the situation clearly herself before she could discuss it clearly with anyone else. When she did write, she stated the facts and her plan for managing them with precision. His response arrived within 4 days, which was fast given the winter roads, and it was characteristically direct. He wrote that he was sorry for the loss, that illness in cattle was one of the particular cruelties of this work, and that if there was anything practical he could do, she should say so, and that if there was not, he would think of her as she managed through it. He did not offer to solve the problem. He did not assume she needed saving. He offered exactly what she could use, which was acknowledgement and the quiet solidarity of someone who had been through hard seasons themselves and knew what they required. She sat with that letter for a long time. In March, the spring was early and the calving went well, better than she had hoped, and when she rode out to check the new calves in the clear March morning, She felt the particular aliveness that came in the aftermath of hard things well survived. Andrew came on the first Sunday in March, and she walked the pasture with him and showed him the new calves, and they talked for 2 hours about cattle and spring plans, and the Hereford breeding program that she had now been corresponding with the Colorado rancher about for nearly a year. He listened with the focused attention she had come to associate entirely with him, asking good questions, offering observations from his own experience without suggesting she needed instruction. It was in the east pasture, with the wind coming mild and the new grass just beginning to show at the roots of the old, that he stopped walking and turned to her. "Helen," he said. She looked at him. Something in his voice was different, a particular quality, careful and more exposed than usual. "I have something to say," he said, "and I want to say it clearly and without complication, and I want you to understand that whatever you answer, I mean it without any condition attached." She waited. The wind moved through the pasture grass. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I believe I have made that reasonably apparent, but I wanted to say it plainly because you deserve plainness from me, and because I am tired of not saying it." Helen stood in her east pasture in the March morning and looked at Andrew Carson, who had walked into a cattle fair in September and had not looked away, who had paid her the right price without argument and called her remarkable for not being afraid, who had helped with her barn roof and written to her through the winter, and offered her exactly what she could use without assuming he knew better than she did what that was. She felt the old grief stir in her, not painfully, more the way something familiar moves when it senses the room is changing. She made space for it, the way she had learned to, and then she looked at what was in front of her and let that be real too. "I know," she said quietly. "I have been watching you be in love with me for several months, and I have been deciding how I feel about it." "And?" he asked, entirely steady, but she could see the effort of that steadiness. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it, which has not been entirely successful." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he moved toward her, and she did not step back, and he kissed her with the particular care of someone who understood that some things required the exact amount of tenderness that the moment called for, no more and no less. The wind was warm for March, and the new grass was showing, and somewhere behind the barn her new calves were making their presence known in the morning light. The spring of 1879 moved through Kansas with its usual contradictions, good days and hard days, and the constant work of a working ranch. Helen and Andrew settled into something that was real and acknowledged and required some navigation, because they were two adults with established lives and a child with opinions, and the shape of what came next was not a simple thing. They were both careful about Clara, because Clara was 8 and had lost her father, and the world had already required considerable adaptation of her. Helen spoke to her daughter with honesty, the way she spoke to Clara about most things, and Clara, who had decided in November that Andrew was acceptable and had been quietly investing in this conclusion since, responded with a characteristic mixture of practicality and genuine feeling. "Do you love him?" Clara asked one evening. "Yes," Helen said. "Does he love you?" "Yes." Clara considered this for a moment. "Does he know about Papa?" "He does," Helen said. "He speaks of your papa with respect." Clara seemed to find this satisfactory. "Will he come to live here?" "We are discussing that," Helen said. "These things take time to arrange properly." "Is that because you have to get married first?" Clara asked, with the directness of a child who had overheard adult conversations and drawn reasonable conclusions. Helen looked at her daughter for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. Clara nodded. "Good," she said. "I think he should fix the fence on the south pasture when he does. It is worse than you think." Helen laughed, and for the second time in 7 months it surprised her with how easily it came. Andrew and Helen were married in June of 1879, in the Caldwell church, on a warm Saturday morning when the Kansas sky was the deep clear blue that it produced in June between the spring storms and the summer heat. It was a modest ceremony, because they were both practical people who did not require ceremony to mean something. But it was attended by more people than Helen had expected, because Caldwell had been watching this unfold since the cattle fair with considerable interest and had apparently developed a proprietary affection for the outcome. Margaret Albright sat in the second row and cried openly and appeared entirely unembarrassed about this. Gerald Marsh attended in his good suit. Pete Dawson came from the ranch and stood in the back in his clean clothes, looking at the floor during the emotional parts. Clara stood beside her mother in a blue dress that matched her eyes, the color of her father's eyes, and she held Helen's hand until the minister said the relevant words, and then she released it, which Helen understood as a gift of the most deliberate kind. Andrew stood at the front of the church with a stillness that she recognized as the quality he had been displaying since the cattle fair, the focused, present attention of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. He wore his good dark coat, and he had clearly made a determined effort with his hair. And when Helen came down the aisle, he looked at her with the same expression she had caught in the corner of the room in September, open and unguarded, and not making any effort to conceal itself. After the ceremony and the modest reception in the church hall, they drove back to the Whitaker ranch in the afternoon light, Andrew and Helen on the wagon seat, and Clara asleep in the wagon bed with her shoes off, and her blue dress slightly the worse for the reception's refreshments. They drove through the long, warm light, and Andrew held the reins with one hand and Helen's hand with the other, and neither of them spoke much, because there was no particular need. The question of the two ranches had been settled with the same practical honesty they brought to most things. Helen would not leave her land, and Andrew had understood this from the beginning, had never suggested she should. The Double C was prosperous enough to continue with a capable foreman, a man named John Reeves whom Andrew trusted completely, and Andrew would move to the Whitaker ranch and manage the combined operations from there, riding to the Double C regularly to oversee. The two operations would be run as separate legal entities for the time being, which the lawyer in Caldwell had documented carefully, because Helen was clear-eyed about the importance of the land remaining in her name, and Andrew was entirely supportive of this. It was not the simplest arrangement, but it was the right one, and the right arrangement is almost never the simplest. The summer of 1879 was a good summer. Andrew's arrival at the Whitaker ranch brought resources and hands and organization that made visible difference in the first weeks, but more than that, it brought the particular quality of two people who both understood the work combining their knowledge. Helen knew the Whitaker land intimately, every fence line and water source and difficult acre. Andrew had 12 years of ranching experience and the structural knowledge of a larger operation. Together, they were more effective than either had been alone, which was not a surprise to either of them but was deeply satisfying nonetheless. The Hereford breeding program that Helen had been planning for 2 years began in earnest that summer, with 4 breeding animals brought up from Colorado, an investment that made the Caldwell banker nervous, and that both Helen and Andrew were entirely calm about, because they had done the calculations, and the calculations were sound. Clara took to the summer with the enthusiasm of a child who had spent 2 years on a ranch with one parent managing everything, and who now found that the ranch had additional people and resources and considerably more activity. She attached herself to John Reeves, Andrew's foreman, during his visits, and learned from him in the informal way children learn from people they find interesting, which alarmed Helen mildly and Andrew not at all. "She is learning the business," Andrew said when Helen expressed this mild alarm. "She is 9, Helen said. "She is your daughter," Andrew said. "When did you start learning the business?" Helen thought about this. She had been helping her father with his accounts since she was approximately Clara's age. "That is not the point," she said, without much conviction. Andrew smiled, and she gave up the argument because it was not a real argument, and she was glad, privately and without saying so, that Clara was learning. The autumn brought good prices, and the Hereford breeding program began to show its first results, and Helen stood in the east pasture in October with her husband beside her, and felt the particular satisfaction of a plan that had been patient and deliberate coming to its first fruition. She also, by October, knew that she was expecting a child. She told Andrew on a Tuesday evening after Clara was asleep in the kitchen with the lamp light between them, and she watched his face move through surprise and then a warmth that was so profound and unguarded that she felt it from across the table. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which was the right first thing, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "I am experienced as it happens." He laughed, and then he came around the table and took her face in his hands with the particular tenderness she had come to know was entirely characteristic of him, careful and entirely genuine. "Helen," he said, and that was all he said for a moment, her name in his voice that still struck her the way a struck bell strikes, clean and resonant and entirely itself. "Do not be sentimental about it," she said, smiling. "I absolutely intend to be sentimental about it," he said. "You may not be if you prefer. I will manage enough sentiment for both of us." She put her hands over his and held them there for a moment. "Clara will have opinions," she said. "Clara always has opinions," he said. "She will want it to be a girl," Helen said. "She may get exactly what she wants," Andrew said. "Or she may not. Either way she will manage admirably." Clara's opinion, when she was informed the following morning, was that if it was a girl, the name should be something sensible and not too long, and if it was a boy, she supposed she could live with that, though she would prefer a horse. Andrew produced the entirely straight face required by this statement and told Clara that he would take it under consideration. Clara nodded and finished her breakfast and went to school. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the hardest Helen had experienced since taking over the ranch, a series of storms rolling through Kansas in January and February with the indifference of nature to human plans. They lost some cattle. The fence on the north pasture came down in a storm and required emergency repair in brutal cold that left Andrew and Pete Dawson and two other hands working through a morning that was 16 degrees by the thermometer and considerably less pleasant than that in practice. Helen managed the house and the accounts and the sick animals that came into the barn and an increasingly uncomfortable pregnancy with the same practical steadiness she brought to everything. And Andrew managed the outdoor work and came in every evening to sit beside her at the kitchen table and give her an honest report of what was happening and listen to her analysis and ideas with complete attention. And Clara did her lessons and helped where she could and grew 2 inches and somehow turned 10 years old in February in the middle of a blizzard, which she found hilarious. Andrew James Carson was born in the last week of March 1880, 3 days after the final winter storm, in the same room where Helen had slept alone for 2 years before the cattle fair. He was born in the early morning with the help of the town's doctor, who had ridden out through the new mud, and he arrived with the lung capacity of someone who intended to make his presence known. Helen held him in the morning light and felt the particular, enormous love of a mother for a new child, which was not different from what she had felt for Clara, and was not less because Clara had come first, but was its own specific thing, this small new person with Andrew's dark hair and what appeared to be Helen's precise gray-green eyes, blinking at the morning with maximum suspicion. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed and held his son with the careful wonder of a first-time father, a wonder that was entirely unself-conscious, and Helen watched him and felt a love for him that was different from the love of the east pasture in March of the previous year, deeper and more particular, the love that comes from a winter survived together and a child held in common. "He is very small," Andrew said, with transparent amazement. "He is a perfectly reasonable size," Helen said. "You are simply not accustomed to infants. He is extraordinary," Andrew said, which was true. Clara came in from where she had been keeping out of the way in the parlor with a determinedness that had evidently required some effort, and she looked at her brother with the expression of someone conducting a serious assessment. "He is very red," she said. "That is normal," Helen said. "He is making a great deal of noise for someone so small," Clara observed. "Also normal," Helen said. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Andrew James," she said, trying out the name. Andrew had asked Clara if she would object to the baby sharing his name, which was a question that Clara had appreciated being asked, and had answered in the affirmative after 48 hours of consideration. "I will call him Jamie," Clara announced, "to avoid confusion." "That is very sensible," Andrew said. "I know," Clara said, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her brother with an expression that was, beneath the assessment and the practicality, entirely soft. The years that followed were the years of building, the kind of building that is invisible in individual days and visible only in retrospect, when a person looks back and sees how far the ground has shifted. The Hereford breeding program proved itself by 1882, when the Whitaker Ranch's first true generation of crossbred cattle brought prices at the Caldwell Fair that made Andrew grin with the particular satisfaction of a plan that has come off. And Helen stand in the fair building with her papers and her catalog, and feel the specific pleasure of a vision made real. The Double C and the Whitaker Ranch were formally merged in that same year, by mutual agreement, and with the assistance of their Caldwell lawyer, into the Carson Whitaker Ranch, which was documented carefully with Helen's name equal and first in the deed, which Andrew had insisted upon, and which the lawyer had initially looked somewhat surprised by but had prepared without comment. They were not without difficulty. The late 1870s and early 1880s in Kansas were not without their injustices, and Helen was not unaware of them. The native peoples of the territory had been systematically driven from lands that were theirs through treaties that were broken with the casual authority of those who had the power to break them, and the great cattle operations that benefited from opened land, including the ranch they ran, existed in a landscape shaped by this history. Helen had grown up in a time when these things were spoken of as progress, and she had come to a more uncomfortable and honest view of them over the years, a view she shared with Andrew, who had his own complicated feelings about the territory he had built his life in, and what that building had required to be possible. These were not things that could be undone by two people on a ranch in Kansas, but they could be held with honesty, and Helen believed that honesty about what was true, even when what was true was difficult, was not a small thing. Jamie grew from an infant into a toddler into a small boy with his father's stillness and his mother's capacity for direct questions, a combination that was either going to serve him very well or make him exhausting company, and which Helen suspected was both. Clara, who turned 11 and then 12 and then 13, became increasingly formidable in the way of bright children given good ground to grow in, and she had by her 12th year decided that she intended to run a ranch of her own someday, which she announced at the dinner table with the calm certainty of someone stating a plan they have already fully formed. Andrew said that he had no doubt she would do exactly that. Helen said that she would teach her everything she knew, which was considerable, and that Clara should remember that the knowing and the doing were equally important. Clara said she understood, and could she please have the last biscuit. In the summer of 1882, Helen discovered she was expecting again. This news was received with the same warmth as the first time, with the addition that Jamie, who was 2 years old and did not fully understand the announcement, was given a biscuit to keep him occupied during the conversation. The second child was a girl, born in the February of 1883, on a day that happened to be clear and cold and so bright with winter light that the room was luminous. They named her Rose Eleanor Carson, Rose for the particular color of her when she arrived, which was a good strong pink, and Eleanor for Andrew's mother, whose name Helen had learned in a letter Andrew had written in December and had found beautiful. Helen lay in the same bed where Jamie had been born, with Rose in her arms and the winter light everywhere, and Andrew beside her, And she thought about the woman who had stood in front of a mirror in September of 1878 and had not wanted to go to the cattle fair, and she could not quite reconcile her with who she was now, which was not a loss but a kind of astonishment. She said something of this to Andrew, not all of it, but the shape of it, the strangeness of looking back at who she had been. He listened, the way he always listened, with the whole of his attention. "You were remarkable then, too," he said simply. "You just did not have anyone to tell you." Helen looked at her daughter, who was investigating the world with the focused interest of someone very new to it. "I had Robert," she said honestly. "He was a good man." "I know," Andrew said. "You would not have become the person you are without him, and without what you built together. I have never been anything but grateful for what came before me." She looked at him then, her husband in the winter light with their daughter between them and their son asleep in the other room and Clara doing her lessons at the kitchen table, and she felt the full weight of how much she had and how clearly she knew it. "Andrew," she said. "Helen," he said, and smiled. The Carson Whitaker Ranch became, over the following years, one of the better regarded operations in that part of Kansas. It was not the largest. Helen had never been interested in largest. But it was well run and consistently profitable, and managed with the kind of integrity that produced a reputation that was worth more than its face value. And by the mid-1880s, when the cattle industry in Kansas was in the contraction that followed the Great Expansion, the Carson Whitaker Ranch was positioned well enough to weather it because they had never overextended and had made decisions based on what was true rather than what was hoped. Clara Whitaker, who turned 16 in 1884 and 17 in 1885, was by then doing genuine work in the ranch management, not as a child helping but as a young person learning a trade, and she was learning it with the same focused intensity she had applied to everything since she was old enough to have opinions, which was approximately from birth. She had in these years a suitor, a young man named Thomas Frey, whose father ran a respectable grain operation outside Caldwell, and who had the good sense to be entirely honest about his interest in Clara, and the good judgment to go to both Helen and Andrew to speak about it before speaking to Clara, which Helen privately thought showed a quality of character that Clara could do worse than having in her life. Clara herself regarded Thomas with the same appraising look she had turned on Andrew in the parlor 6 years earlier, and Thomas bore the examination with a steadiness that suggested he either had genuine character or was very good at appearing to, and Helen had learned over the years that the two were usually the same thing. Helen did not interfere. She watched, and she trusted her daughter, and she answered Clara's questions about men and partnership, and what it meant to build a life with someone with the full honesty of a woman who had done it twice and understood what it required. Jamie, at 5 and then 6, grew into a boy who was at his happiest outdoors, who could already ride a horse with confident ease, and who followed Andrew around the ranch with the focused dedication of someone absorbing everything in sight. He had the patience of his father and the directness of his mother, and he applied both to the cattle with a seriousness that the ranch hands found entertaining, and Andrew found deeply satisfying in the way that seeing someone love what you love is always satisfying. Rose was the wild card, which was perhaps what third children are in families where the older two have established the personalities. She was bright and curious, and moved through the world with a joy that was entirely her own, singing to the chickens and carrying on extended conversations with the dogs, and finding everything interesting in a way that was completely unguarded and that lit up every room she was in. By the spring of 1885, when Helen and Andrew had been married for 6 years and the ranch was operating at its best capacity, and Clara was 17 and Jamie was 5 and Rose was 2. There was an evening in April when the last of the day's work was done, and the children were all in the house, Clara at the table with her books and Jamie asleep, and Rose on the kitchen floor with the collie dog. And Helen and Andrew sat on the front porch in the mild April evening, the way they had sat on the porch in the November dark 6 years before. The stars were the same. The vast, indifferent, glorious Kansas stars, too many to count, filling up the dark with light that had traveled longer distances than any human concern. "Do you remember," Helen said, "when you came to the cattle fair?" "Very clearly," Andrew said. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "When you were watching me from the corner." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing words with care. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that you were the most alive person in the room. And the most alone, and that those two things together were the saddest and most beautiful thing I had seen in a long time." Helen sat with this for a moment. April night moved around them, warm and soft. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I told you once that you called me remarkable for not looking afraid. I want you to know that I was afraid. I was afraid every day." "I know," he said. "You said you found it remarkable that I did not look afraid," she said. "Not that I was not afraid." "Yes," he said. "That is the remarkable thing. Anyone can be unafraid of something that is not frightening. Being afraid and going anyway is the thing that means something." Helen looked at the stars for a moment. Then she said, "I am glad I went." "So am I," Andrew said, "every single day." She leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the April dark with the stars overhead, and the children inside, and the land around them that they had built something real and lasting on, and the night was quiet and warm and entirely sufficient. The following years brought their own texture, their own particular mix of the good and the hard that any real life contains. The drought of 1886 was difficult, as it was for every rancher in the territory, and Helen and Andrew managed it with the careful reserves they had built and the practical decisions of people who had learned not to panic. The cattle market shifted again, as it always did, and they adjusted again, as they always did. Clara married Thomas Frey in the autumn of 1886, when she was 18 years old, in a ceremony held at the Carson Whitaker ranch, because Clara had decided the ranch was where she was from and where the ceremony should be. Thomas had proposed to her in May and she had accepted, and her engagement had the quality of a decision made by someone who had thought it through completely and was entirely confident in her conclusion. Helen stood beside her daughter as she was married on the ranch in the October light, and she felt the particular joy and particular grief that is the combination of watching your child begin their own life. The grief not because anything was lost, but because something was completed, and the completion of things always has a finality in it that is beautiful and aching in equal measure. Andrew stood beside Helen during the ceremony, and she could feel that he understood all of this without being told. Thomas Frey was a good man, which was the most important thing, and he loved Clara with the steady, honest attention of someone who understood what he had. Clara would not have accepted less, and Helen had taught her that, and Robert had taught her that too, in the particular way that absent parents teach their children by the love they carried when they were present. After Clara's wedding, in the evening when the guests had gone and Thomas had taken his new wife to the house in Caldwell where they would begin their life, Helen walked through the quiet ranch in the October dark and felt the full span of what her life had become. The yearlings she had sold at the cattle fair in 1878 had led to a conversation that had led to a Sunday afternoon in a parlor that had led to everything she was standing inside now, the children and the land and the man who came to find her on the porch. "Are you all right?" Andrew asked, coming to stand beside her in the dark. "I am so much better than all right," she said. "I am thinking about how things begin." "How things begin?" "You bought 3 yearlings," she said. "And I came home with my $56 and Clara had already decided you were acceptable." She paused. "And now she is married and Jamie is going to be 7 in March and Rose can already read and the ranch is the best it has ever been." Andrew put his hands on her shoulders from behind, warm and steady. "Things begin in small moments," he said, "and then they become everything. I walked into that fair by myself," she said, "and I was so determined not to need anyone." "You did not need anyone," he said. "You needed someone who was worth having." She turned to face him in the October dark, this man who had stood in the corner of the cattle fair in September of 1878 and had not looked away, who had paid her the right price without argument and called her remarkable for going anyway, who had helped with her barn roof and written to her through the winter and loved her daughter and built something real and lasting beside her on this land. "I love you," she said plainly, the way she said most important things. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew what to do with it." She leaned up and kissed him in the October dark, and the stars were above them and the land was around them, and the house was lit with the lamplight of Jamie and Rose asleep inside, and everything was closed and complete and fully itself. In the spring of 1887, the Carson-Whitaker Ranch welcomed its fourth Hereford breeding bull, a fine animal from the Colorado operation that had been their source since 1880, and Andrew rode back from the railway station with it in considerable satisfaction, and Helen met him at the paddock with her catalog and her notes, and they stood together in the morning light looking at their best investment to date. Clara came to visit that Sunday with Thomas, and she was by that spring expecting her first child, which she announced with the same pragmatic certainty with which she announced most things, and which Helen received with the particular warmth of a grandmother in the making, a role she had not yet considered and which, when she held it up to the light, fit her surprisingly well. "I thought you would be sentimental," Clara said, watching her mother's face. "I am being entirely practical about it," Helen said. "I have considerable experience, and I intend to be useful." Clara smiled, which was Robert's smile on her face, and which Helen still sometimes caught off guard by in the middle of ordinary days. "Of course you do," Clara said. Jamie turned 7 that March with the energy of a boy who had been waiting impatiently for the number 7, which he had decided was considerably more impressive than 6, and he received a new saddle from Andrew and a hand-bound notebook from Helen in which to write the ranch observations that he had already begun keeping in a general exercise book. He received this gift with the solemnity of someone being given a professional document. Rose, who was 4, received a birthday of her own in February and spent it singing to the horses, which had become her primary form of self-expression and which the horses appeared to find acceptable. In September of 1887, Clara had her first child, a boy named Robert Thomas Frey, for Clara's father, and when Helen held her grandson for the first time she felt the particular, enormous loop of time closing and opening simultaneously, Robert's name alive again in the world in a new person, carried forward by his daughter who had his jaw and her mother's eyes. She sat with the baby in the chair by Clara's window and thought about a man who had died in the winter of 1876 and who she had loved and who she still carried, and she thought about what he had left behind, this daughter with his stubborn jaw, this land he had dreamed about, this life that she had built from the wreckage of losing him, and she thought that he would have been glad. She thought he would have liked Andrew, actually. Would have recognized in him the quality of a man who was worth having, the steadiness and the honesty and the way he looked at Helen as if she was genuinely remarkable. Robert had been a man who wanted good things for his wife, and he would have recognized good things. Andrew came in presently, and she handed him the baby, and he held this grandson with the same careful wonder he had held Jamie 7 years before, which had not diminished with experience, and Clara watched from her bed with Thomas beside her, and the entire room was full of the warm, particular light of a thing that is right. By the autumn of 1887, 9 years after Helen Whitaker had walked into the Caldwell cattle fair alone, the Carson-Whitaker Ranch was the best version of everything it had always had the potential to be. The Hereford program was fully established and producing results that justified every calculation they had made. The land was in the best condition it had been since Helen's earliest years there, the fences solid and the water sources managed, and the pastures rotated with the knowledge of people who had learned to work with the land rather than against it. John Reeves, Andrew's foreman, ran the former Double C land with the capable authority of a man who had been doing it for 10 years, and the Carson-Whitaker operation as a whole, employed 6 hands year-round and additional help in the busy seasons, all of whom were paid fair wages at a time when fair wages were not universal in the territory, which was something Helen had been precise about from the beginning, and Andrew had agreed with entirely. Pete Dawson, who had been with the ranch since before Andrew arrived, was part of the permanent crew and had become one of those fixtures of a place that becomes part of its character, reliable and familiar and impossible to imagine the ranch without. Jamie, in the spring of his 7th year, began accompanying Andrew on the serious work of the ranch, in the way that he had accompanied Pete in his younger years, absorbing the larger scope of management, with the focused attention his father had recognized as his primary quality since birth. Helen watched this and felt the same mix of pleasure and the mild alarm that Clara had once inspired, the pleasure of a child becoming themselves, the alarm that they were becoming themselves so fast. "He will run this ranch someday," Andrew said one evening, watching Jamie assist with evening rounds with the seriousness of a small man learning his trade. "He and Rose both," Helen said, because Rose at 4 was already demonstrating that while she expressed herself in song, her practical intelligence was formidable. Andrew smiled. "The ranch may need to be considerably larger by the time they are both running it," he said. "We will build it accordingly," Helen said, and he looked at her with the expression she had seen first in the corner of a room in September of 1878, focused and warm and entirely real. On the evening of the 9th anniversary of their first meeting, which Helen acknowledged as the date of the cattle fair because that was where it had begun, they sat on the front porch in the September dark as they often sat on evenings when the work was done, and the children were settled, and the night was warm enough to permit it. Andrew had brought out 2 cups of coffee because they had drunk coffee together on the first afternoon they had truly talked, and it had become, in the way of small things in a long life together, something that carried meaning beyond itself. 9 years, Helen said. 9 years since the fair, Andrew said. "You were very unsubtle," she said. "I was completely unsubtle," he agreed. "I was also entirely serious from the first moment." "I know," she said. "That is why I was not alarmed." He looked at her. "Were you at all alarmed?" She considered this with the honest consideration she gave everything. "I was," she said, "not by you, by myself. By the fact that I was capable of being interested. Did that seem wrong to you?" "It seemed complicated," she said. "It seemed like something that would require courage." "And did you have it?" he asked, though he knew the answer and she knew he knew. "I went to the fair," she said simply. He reached across the gap between their chairs and took her hand, the way he had held her hand for 9 years, with the particular quality of his touch that was careful and warm and entirely certain. And Helen held his hand in return. The stars were above them, the same stars that had been above them on every porch evening since the November of their first real meeting, the same vast, beautiful, indifferent stars that had been above the territory long before any person had arrived to build a ranch or break a heart or find their way back to being alive. But the people under them were not the same. They were made differently by 9 years of shared work, and shared love and children and loss and building, and all the ordinary extraordinary days that constitute a life built in common. They were made better by each other, which was not a small thing, and which Helen knew with the same clear-eyed certainty with which she knew cattle prices and fence conditions, and exactly how much feed to put by for a hard winter. "Are you happy?" Andrew asked, which was not a question he asked often, but asked occasionally with the sincerity of someone who genuinely wanted to know and did not assume the answer. Helen thought about the word. She had been happy before in her first marriage in the good years, with Robert on the land they were building. She had been devastated after. She had been determined and exhausted and lonely and capable and all the complicated things that 2 years of surviving alone had made her. And then she had walked into a fair and there had been a man in the corner. "I am happy," she said, and it was the truest thing she had said in 9 years, which was a high bar because she was a truthful woman. Andrew squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said simply. Every day. The coffee was warm, the stars were out. The children were asleep in the house behind them, Jamie deep in his earnest boy's dreams, and Rose singing even in sleep, according to the reports of anyone who slept near her. Clara's boy, little Robert Thomas, was growing toward a first birthday in the house on the edge of Caldwell, where Clara and Thomas were making their own life. And the Carson Whitaker ranch lay around them in the September night, the land that had been Robert's dream and Helen's inheritance and Andrew's contribution and all of theirs together. The fence lined solid and the cattle settled, and the Hereford bulls in the good pasture, and the future of it carried in the minds of a 7-year-old boy who kept a ranch notebook and a 4-year-old girl who sang to horses. Helen Whitaker, who was now Helen Carson and had been for 9 years and had lost nothing of who she was in the change of name but only added to it, sat on her porch in the September dark and felt the full and complete weight of a life that was entire. She had walked into the cattle fair alone, and the cowboy in the corner had never taken his eyes off her. And that had been, it turned out, exactly enough.